So after Shays' rebellion, the colonists all agree that they're going to have to form some type of a stronger government to deal with these rebellions and these issues with the economy. They had a failed attempt at a meeting in Annapolis, Maryland in September of 1786. Not enough states showed up. Then in Philadelphia in May of 1787, they had another attempt, and 12 of the 13 came. Now that wasn't enough to have a vote on a revision of the Articles of Confederation. So they just said, let's scrap it and start over anew. And that's what they did. So what was going through the minds of the Founding Fathers at this convention? With regards to human nature, you remember that John Locke advocated that people were generally good and should be left with the majority of the government in their hands, whereas Hobbes thought that men were wicked and stupid and needed a strong central government to kind of tell them what to do. The Founding Fathers preferred the ideas of Locke, but they were not naive enough as to disregard those of Hobbes, and so they understood that they had to contain that natural love for power and self-interest that people had. They also understood that most of the revolutions in Europe and throughout history had to do with distribution of wealth, the rich and the poor, and so they intended to have a way to check that as well, as we shall see. So remember, these guys all came from England, them or their fathers or grandfathers, with the purpose of having their own land and being free on that land. So land was really, and property rather, was really the most important thing to the Founding Fathers, and they intended to protect that, and they made that really the object of the Constitution, to protect property. And conveniently for those that didn't have property, including slaves, they would not receive those rights. They also knew that, based on what Montesquieu had written, that the nature of government is such that if you don't check the power of one person or one group, then they will turn it into absolute power, and so they decided to separate the branches of government, as we'll see, based on that balance of powers philosophy. So we're going to see several issues rise up during this convention, the first of which is, how will the representatives from the states be chosen? We have big states like Virginia proposing that representation be based on population. And obviously that favors the large states, because the more people you have, the more representatives in Congress you have, and you have more of a say than those small states. Whereas you have William Patterson from New Jersey that says that's not fair, and each state should be equally represented with 1 or 2 representatives per state. Now, on the other hand, doesn't that make it unfair for the large states, whose population per capita, you could say, is now going to have less democratic voice than those other states? So something had to be done to resolve this matter. And Mr. Johnson of Connecticut has the solution. It's a compromise, which most of the Constitution you'll find is basically a compromise. So his idea was to have 2 houses of a legislature, a bicameral, with the Senate representing 2 members from each state to appease the small states, and then the House based on population to appease the large states like Virginia. And so this was seen to be pretty fair. Some people would still argue that states such as Wyoming, which are extremely small, are disproportionately represented in Congress, as you could see here. On to the issue of slavery. There were many voices from the North at this convention crying that it was incongruous to have a Declaration of Independence and a Constitution that supposedly spoke of natural rights and guaranteed the liberties of man, while at the same time enslaving human beings. There was enough opposition, though, from the South, from states that understood that their economy was based on slaves, and without those, they would really not be able to compete with northern states. And so they would not ratify this Constitution without some type of compromise. And so it led, of course, to a couple of things, one being the 3/5 compromise, which would say that these southern states, which were less represented, would be able to count more people towards their population to have more representatives in Congress. That was called the 3/5 compromise, so a slave is 3/5 of a person, of course. And also the Fugitive Slave Act, which said that if a slave were to escape to the north, he would have to be returned. This would obviously deal with the idea that once slaves hear that there's a free north and a enslaved south, that they wouldn't just flee to the northern state. With property being so important to the Founding Fathers, many of the convention goers believed that you should not be allowed to vote unless you own property. After all, if you have property, you're probably somewhat successful and not an idiot. But they were very fearful of having the masses, which they thought were pretty stupid, making the important decisions. Um, but then there's that whole idea of fairness and democracy and being different from England, etc. And so they had to eventually compromise in saying, let's let the states decide who's going to vote. And that's why all the way up into the 20th century, you have individual states like Utah being the first to say, well, let's let women vote, before there's actually constitutional amendments guaranteeing for the national level individuals of different origins and genders, etc., to be able to vote. And good grief, where to begin with the economic issues? We know that states were not getting along with regards to trading and buying and selling of products, and having different currency. It would be difficult to go from one state to the next and purchase something. You had to exchange the money. You also had states where the money was worthless because they had created too much of it, causing inflation. And so Congress agrees that this time around they're going to have to find a better way for the federal government to have revenue and to control the money supply. And so they definitely write a lot of that into the Constitution. You'll have historians such as Charles Beard, who you see here in the 1950s, who are going to kind of look at the Constitution being created with this in mind and accuse the Founding Fathers of doing it all for personal economic gain. And certainly many of them had IOUs and such that were owed to them, and were looking to get some of that back. But most of the evidence found since the 1950s by historians points to the Founding Fathers definitely being concerned about the economy and establishing a strong economy, but not for personal gain at the expense of other Americans. But they actually had ideological and political ideas representing their own states, that they were there to represent and protect their state interests more than their personal interests, which is kind of good to know. On the issue of individual rights, the Founding Fathers were actually surprised when people started calling for a Bill of Rights to be added. After all, they felt that the Constitution did a great job of limiting the power of the government versus the people, and even specified, as you can see here in this chart, several rights that were guaranteed to individuals. And yet, in order to ratify the Constitution, they did have to add the Bill of Rights with more guaranteed rights of individuals. The final and most important issue we faced was the dilemma of reconciling the majority rule with the protection of minority interests. And James Madison understood better than anybody that both the majority and the minority had the potential to take over the government and use it to their own advantage at the expense of the other, as you can see here in this quote. So because our leaders are obviously not angels, nor are the people that the leaders lead, there was definitely a need for some type of system of checks and balances. So let's talk now about some of the ways that Madison proposed we check those powers of both the majority and the minority. The first way was to place as much of the government as possible beyond the direct control of the majority. So as you can see here, the voters, the people, were allowed to elect representatives to the House directly, but they made it more indirect with regards to the Senate and as well as the President. The Senate was chosen by state legislatures at the state level, and that was later changed by constitutional amendment, of course. But what we still have today is the Electoral College, and problem here was that the founders thought, we're not going to have this one powerful person chosen by the masses, because heaven forbid they elect some Hollywood movie star or some knucklehead. And so we're going to have the Electoral College to ensure that things go our way. And thanks to Baron de Montesquieu of France in the Enlightenment period, we adopted this idea of separate branches of government that would check one another. Here we can see we have three branches. The way we can see the checking occurring is, let's start with the legislative branch. They pass a law. In order for that law to become enacted, it has to be signed by the president. And then, if that law is enacted and the courts decide it's unconstitutional, they are still allowed to declare it unconstitutional. Um, Another way that this can happen is, let's say that the legislative branch passes a law, the president vetoes it, but the legislative branch wants to override that veto. They can do so with a 2/3 majority. So there are a whole lot of ways, as you can see, for checks and balances to kind of iron out any kind of wrinkles that might occur in democracy from its complexity. The last word today is that the Constitution of 1787 is not the Constitution of today, and the powers that the branches of government have today were not necessarily the powers that the branches had in 1787. Since then, there have been many instances, including court cases, such as Marbury versus Madison, which you're going to learn about, as well as constitutional amendments that have kind of shaped and reshaped, reconfigured the Constitution and the rights that people have based upon that Constitution and the laws that can be made and upheld based upon it. So thanks for being with us, and good luck on your exam.